Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today we're going to take a look at Mercury's upcoming conjunction with Saturn in the very last degree of Aquarius. So we started this week by looking at Venus's conjunction with Jupiter in the sign of Aries. That conjunction is happening at the same time that Mercury is pulling into this conjunction with Saturn. So they're both worth spending some time with. So that's how we're opening our week. We're going to look at 10 different manifestations, very common manifestations of the Mercury-Saturn combination. And hopefully this will prepare you for that transit as well. And taking yesterday's video with today's, you'll kind of have a full, more of a well-rounded picture of what the major astrology of this week looks like. So, and then we are, by the way, tomorrow we'll be getting into the astrology of the month ahead. I have a special guest who will be joining me to talk with me about the astrology of March. So that should be really interesting. And yeah, but before we get into it today, don't forget to like and subscribe, share your comments in the comment section, really helps the channel to grow. You can find transcripts of any of my daily talks, as always, on the website, nightlightastrology.com. If you have a story to share this week about either Venus, Jupiter, or Mercury, Saturn, some of the big transits of the week, use the hashtag grabbed or email us your story, grabbed@nightlightastrology.com. I'm making another storytelling episode at some point here coming up. And it's always valuable to hear what kinds of experiences you guys are having as the transits come through. Really appreciate when you guys share those stories. So thank you in advance for that. All right, let's take a look at the real-time clock and let's get a feel for what's going on here. All right, so we can see yesterday we looked at the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Aries. That is coming through on Wednesday, March 1st. And if we just take this forward a little bit, now that's happening late Central Time anyway. That's happening late Wednesday evening. But if we move this forward some hours, we're going to find that Mercury conjoins Saturn right around 9 in the morning on Thursday, March 2nd. So they follow so closely together. You'll see by that time Venus is still conjoined Jupiter, but just separating at the time that Mercury is just getting together with Saturn by Thursday morning. So they're just boom, boom, right in a row. But technically, you could say you'll be feeling both the Venus-Jupiter transit and the Mercury-Saturn transit all week. These transits, if I push this forward just a little bit more into Friday, Mercury is still just 2 degrees off from Saturn as it switches into Pisces. And then Venus is still just 1 degree off from Jupiter by Friday. So I would say safely, you could probably feel these archetypal combinations all the way until Saturday, but Friday is probably a little bit safer since Mercury is changing signs. Anyway, so that's what we're looking at today. We're going to give you 10 things to watch for. Now, what I want to say is also that it is really important that this is happening at an anaretic degree. Anaretic degrees are the very last and final degrees of any sign. And those degrees tend to be ruled by the malefics from the standpoint of the bounds. Every sign is broken into 5 unequal sections with a planet ruling the subsection of degrees within each sign. And the very final degrees of every sign are typically ruled by the malefics. So when you get into, let's see, final degree of Aquarius, let me pull out my bound rulership sheet here. I don't have them memorized. And if you do, wow, that's impressive. Yeah, so last degree of Aquarius is the bound of Saturn. So we have a lot of power for Saturn here in this dynamic as Saturn is preparing to leave its own sign and its own bound and enter Pisces, which we'll be talking about in the Astrology of March video. But this also happens as Mercury is passing through a conjunction with Saturn in the bound and rulership of Saturn, and then immediately entering its fall in the sign of Pisces. So today, what I'm going to say will be archetypally relevant for any Mercury-Saturn combination. So this would be evergreen content. You could always look at this in a sense to get some idea of what Mercury-Saturn combinations are like, whether you're talking about a square, an opposition, a conjunction, a sextile, or a trine. However, I am going to be adding a little flavor to this as we go along that acknowledges the anaretic degree that's present, the Saturn heavy rulership of Aquarius and the bound of Saturn at this last degree, and then the fact that Mercury is also about to enter its fall. So I'll try to spice it up a little bit with those details. But anyway, let's get into it. Number 1 would be intellectual rigor. So a super common Mercury-Saturn theme is people who like to learn and study a lot. people who like to think, and people who like to exercise the mind, like people who like to go to the gym and exercise their bodies. Um, Anyone that has the desire to be sort of hardcore when it comes to learning, study, reading, writing, and has a mind that it just is geared toward the life of scholarship or study. That tends to be a Mercury-Saturn combination. Now, one of the potential downsides of this would be there's a way in which when Mercury conjoins with Saturn in the bound of Saturn, the sign of Saturn about to enter its fall, that there could be some way in which a subject that you like is failing you, or you're feeling bored or frustrated by it. And you could see yourself somehow losing interest or changing interests because of the combination of the anaretic degree and then the big shift for Mercury that happens as it enters its fall afterward. So I'm going to try to add little spices like that as we go to every one, but that's just an idea. Number two would be careful planning. Any Mercury-Saturn combination tends to have us planning things out very carefully. Whether that's sort of like a strategic way of ordering the things that we do, or priority of time, energy, money, or resources. There's just an element of very careful planning. Now, add in the anaretic degree and the shift of Mercury, the Saturn emphasis, and you get almost something like don't overplan from the standpoint of worry and fear and anxiety, and sort of spin yourself out and end up losing control because you're white knuckling things too much. That would be one potential downside given the big shift Mercury's about to go through. Number three would be wordsmithing. It's funny how many people who I was looking back at one point, I was Facebook stalking people who were in my creative writing programs in graduate school. And one of the things I noticed, because I could just look at their birthday, right? I don't have their time, but I could see their birthday on their Facebook. So I was looking just to see where the planets were on the date of birth of people in my class. Not because I wanted to ascertain anything other than why did they like writing. This is just something that I got interested in at one point. And one of the things that I saw over and over again in most of the charts of my classmates were Mercury-Saturn contacts. It's a sort of a wordsmith signature. People who like to, find the right combinations of words that are good editors, or that are take that careful planning and put it into the idea of shaping the ideal sentence or paragraph. Most of the people who had Mercury-Saturn in my programs were teaching fellows who were also teaching composition to undergrads. So wordsmithing is definitely a thing. However, if you are trying to be overly controlling about the way that you use words or speech, you could find that things will easily tilt in the opposite direction and get completely away from you if you try to, again, white knuckle it too much, because the kind of shift that Mercury is about to go through, going from this sort of really intense sort of final Saturnian degree in an air sign into, the sign of its fall and detriment in water. It's like, don't be surprised if you go in a dramatically different direction, like very shortly after trying to be overly controlling with like words or ideas. Number four would be a preference for structured presentations. Mercury, Saturn, whether it's presentation of information or words or thoughts, there's just a preference for structure and the tendency to speak, think, and relate better in and through like very well organized, structured things. So now, again, the downside of this would be that the potential for a pretty drastic swing into something more fluid, intuitive, emotional, vulnerable, boundaryless is possible very quickly after this moment that looks like it could be much more rigid. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, that there's a pretty dramatic swing from the sort of rigid Saturnian objective logical space into like a very emotional, fluid, boundaryless space. Number five, and that's happening, by the way, this week, just so that you're aware, the entrance of Mercury into Pisces happens, here it is, it happens right about 5 o'clock, March 2nd, that's Thursday, in the morning. the morning of March 3rd is when we have the conjunction. So it's very shortly after. It's like a wild day. And from standpoint of Mercury, it's a pretty wild day. Anyway, rigid thinking is definitely a Mercury-Saturn kind of thing. You have to be careful of getting stuck in patterns of thought or behavior, which could include getting stuck in depressive or anxious thoughts. Sometimes there's a kind of melancholic vibe with Mercury-Saturn, a little too austere or rigid in the way one thinks or perceives. But this could be followed by an opening or a healing of an overly rigid perception with Mercury moving into a water sign right away. Number 6 would be practical but unimaginative. And maybe the transition into Pisces helps to open up a more sensual, romantic, imaginative, and intuitive space. But you may see that you almost like you're hitting your head against a kind of practical, overly concrete set of thoughts or ideas or an approach to something, and it doesn't work. And you have to be kind of, you could see the person who's like overly logical being their approach being broken down until they're like crying, and then who knows what could open up because of a few tears coming down, But the idea here would be sometimes Mercury and Saturn are practical, philosophical, reasonable, articulate, and mentally focused, but sometimes unimaginative, uninspiring, unemotional. So watch for those things and watch for the juxtaposition between those things to be really intense on Thursday of this week. Number 7 would be impersonal approaches to knowledge or wisdom. So, for example, any kind of spiritual path that says your individual sense of identity is an illusion, and you should merge into the ground of being, where there is no distinction between I and thou, or self and other. There's just being. This dissolution of individual personality and individual differences and diversity of forms and beings and relationships between diverse forms and beings tends to represent a kind of impersonal approach, which is not to say it's invalid. But, for example, practices that tend toward detachment, objectivity, a dissolution of self, identity, or ego into something like the undifferentiated oneness of all being that knows no distinction, that has no, where there is no separate sense of unique identity or selfhood. Those tend to be impersonal, which does not mean bad, but any kind of impersonal approach to spirituality would be often indicated by something like Mercury-Saturn, a detached Stoic perspective, for example. Now, there would also be the same thing could be said for, the equivalent in like universities might be like empiricism or, interest in truth insofar as truth is sort of objectively demonstrated or proven through maybe kind of cause and effect. What's interesting is that when Mercury enters Pisces, it goes into a space that is highly subjective and relational. It's the water sign of where Venus is exalted. So I could also see there being some almost like an over-reliance or dependence upon some rather impersonal approach to knowing that is being challenged during this week to become more subjective and interpersonal, to become more, emotionally oriented rather than like objectively and rationally oriented. And it's not that one is right or wrong, but you could see the juxtaposition between the two being really strong this week. Anyway, number 8 is skepticism, doubt, worry, or cynicism. Any of these can be, maybe cynicism is not always a great thing. It's almost like a habitual distrust. But the potential to be concerned or worried for you're perceiving information and you're sort of rationally calculating things and going like, yeah, this doesn't look good. It's a good week to be like discerning and careful and skeptical and very thoughtful and, objective about what you're looking at and making decisions based on a kind of fair, broad, objective evaluation. And some level of skepticism, doubt, concern, calling things into question may be necessary. On the other hand, if there's not enough of it, you could see this week being problematic, because there may be a call to do so, but a failure to do so, shown by the juxtaposition between the conjunction with Saturn and the immediate entrance into watery Pisces. On the other hand, you could see it going the opposite way. With the same archetypal combination, you could see someone who is trying to, that they're letting their doubt, their worry, and their need to like control everything mentally deal with some level of uncertainty. And then it turns out that you can't. Life has to include some uncertainties and some pretty deep subjective spaces that you can only feel through based on your heart, your feelings, and vulnerable exchanges with other beings that there's no calculus for. So anyway, number 9 would be wise judgment. It's, again, going along with the last one, the idea that we could reach a wise judgment, and the promise that wise judgment maybe combines at best a sensual and rational dimension, cooperating. But on the other hand, you could see, I need to make a wise judgment, and emotions just can't have anything to do with this. But then, on the other hand, not letting emotions in could end up, if you're not able to reach into your heart to ask yourself what is true, or what is real, or what should I do based on what do I feel, then you're lacking at least one dimension of what goes into making the best judgment. So some juxtaposition around how we make judgments, how we think, how we use our mind, and how we strategize, and how we involve more feminine dimensions alongside of more like rational masculine dimensions. It seems like it could be a part of this week. Number 10 would be detached, big picture thinking. And I've already sort of mentioned this in a few different ways, but the last one here, I'll just say that if you need that 20,000 foot view, this is a great transit for that view. Just don't expect that the big objective picture will last. At best, it may help you through what will probably continue on to be an experience that you struggle to define clear boundaries within, or that you struggle to make sense of. We are complex beings that often will have what seem like contradictory thoughts and feelings about things. Most of the time, I think that, rather than trying to figure out, who wins here, which is the right thought or evaluation or feeling about what's happening, we ought to give ourselves more time to experience our own multidimensional response to life. It's like, how often do we give ourselves time to just sit down and feel and think all that we're feeling and thinking about something? If you do that long enough with a spaciousness in your heart and mind, it's amazing how we intuitively know how to respond and what to do and how to strategize. And we're able to see what's real, and we're able to sort through doubts, and we're able to answer good critical questions, and we're able to include our feelings. So I hope that this talk has opened this archetypal combination in a way that prepares you to see it at work in your life this week. Remember, this is happening alongside of Venus and Jupiter. My advice would be not so much figuring out how to synthesize all of them, as much as you should listen to that video too if you haven't already. And just by listening to these two videos, you'll be able to notice. And maybe one of them is one of the archetypal combinations. Venus-Jupiter, for example, might be more prominent for you this week than Venus-Saturn. It probably depends on your individual birth chart in some ways. But just creating space for both of these archetypes to be at work this week, it should help us to notice them and to notice the way that they're having an impact on our lives, our work, our relationships, and so forth. Okay, we will be looking at the astrology of March tomorrow, and I'll have a special guest on the show. A friend of mine and local astrologer Sean Nygaard will be here to discuss his new podcast and also give us some of his thoughts on Saturn's entrance into Pisces and Pluto's entrance into Aquarius, which form the major astrology of March. So that should be really fun. I look forward to seeing you all then, and I hope you guys are having a good start to your week. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.